Now we all know that Christmas is supposed to be a time of joy, family, and peace. But tonight I have a story that will make you look at your holiday traditions a little different. Welcome to Tyler Medeiros TV. Now imagine this. You're back home with your family, gathered around the Christmas tree, when a shadow appears in the corner of the room. At first, it's subtle, easy to dismiss, until it starts to move. And just when you think it's all in your head, the temperature drops, and the room grows eerily cold. This isn't just a ghost story. It's a dark family secret that's been hidden for years, and it's about to be uncovered. Stay tuned as we dive into the terrifying story of the Christmas Eve shadow and explore the chilling events that unfolded on the unforgettable night in the Johnson family home. But before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and give this video a thumbs up. Now let's unravel the mystery. The fire was crackling softly, casting a warm, flickering glow that danced across the darkened corners of the room. The scent of pine and cinnamon clung to the air, and the soft hum of festive music filled the space. Outside, the world was blanketed in snow, a gentle, peaceful stillness that contrasted with the growing unease. Inside the Johnson family's old Victorian home, it was Christmas Eve, and the family had gathered around their tree, a towering spruce covered in sparkling lights and sentimental ornaments that told the story of generations past. Everything felt perfect. The air seemed to hum with warmth and joy, and for Emily, it was the perfect escape from the pressure of adult life. She'd been away for years living in the city, working long hours and trying to manage the chaos that came with being an adult. So this trip home was meant to be a time for peace, for reconnecting with her parents, and for enjoying the family traditions that had always grounded her. Her mother Miriam was in the kitchen, humming a Christmas carol as she prepared a fresh batch of her famous sugar cookies. Emily's father Daniel reclined in his favorite armchair by the fire, nursing a glass of scotch, his eyes distant as he reflected on the days when their home had been full of children. Ethan, her younger brother, was curled up on the couch, his face illuminated by the faint glow of his phone screen. He had grown into a quiet young man, withdrawn from the world around him, more interested in his gadgets than in the family gathering. Despite the absence of the familiar chaos that once filled their home, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of comfort. It had been years since they had all been together, and she cherished the moment of peace. It felt like everything was exactly as it should be. But that peaceful evening was about to take a sinister turn. At first, it was just a flicker, a slight shift in the corner of the room next to the family's grand piano. Emily thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection from the tree, or the subtle flicker of the fire's flames. Her eyes were heavy from a long day of travel, and she blamed the wariness for the odd sensation that something was off. She dismissed it, but when she glanced back a few moments later, it was still there. A shadow. Not the shadow of a person, not cast by the fire or any of the lamps, but a dark, inky shape that seemed to linger unnaturally in the corner. It wasn't the shape of anything familiar, a chair, a picture frame, or even a person, but something else entirely. Emily felt a strange unease, but she tried to convince herself it was nothing. The house, after all, was old. The creaking floors, the drafty windows, and the shifting of the wood beneath her feet had always been part of its charm. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to shake off the discomfort. But as the evening wore on, she couldn't ignore it any longer. The shadow was still there. Her heart started to race as she looked at the others. Miriam, her mother, was humming in the kitchen, oblivious. Daniel was lost in his own world, sipping his drink, and Ethan hadn't noticed anything either, his attention still glued to his phone. The shadow remained still, hanging in the corner like it was almost waiting. Emily's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair, a knot of unease building in her stomach. She stood, her legs heavy as though the air had grown thicker. The room suddenly felt colder, as if the warmth from the fire was being slowly drained away. But no one else seemed to notice. She approached the shadow cautiously, each step growing heavier than the last. The temperature began to drop even further, an icy chill creeping over her skin. She could see her breath now, visible in the air, forming tiny puffs of mist that drifted before her. Her feet felt cold against the old wooden floor, and her hands began to tremble. The house, so full of warmth just moments before, now seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. As Emily reached out toward the shadow, her pulse quickened, her heart thundering in her chest. The air felt wrong, suffocating, as if something unseen was pressing against her. The shadow? It wasn't right. Her fingers hovered inches from it, a cold sensation biting at her skin, as though the shadow itself were alive. Something that shouldn't exist. Then, as if it had sensed her presence, the shadow shifted. It wasn't a smooth, natural movement, but an unnatural, jerking motion that made her stomach turn. It slithered along the wall, stretching as it moved toward the center of the room. It wasn't like anything she had ever seen. It wasn't just a shadow. It was something else. Something dark. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she tried to call for her mom and dad, but no one responded. Her mother hummed contentedly in the kitchen. Her father's eyes were still unfocused. And Ethan was still glued to his phone. Emily's skin prickled as the shadow seemed to grow, expanding, stretching out like dark fingers reaching for her. The cold was unbearable now, and her breath came out in quick, shallow gasps. And then, just as she thought she might collapse, it spoke. The voice wasn't a sound. It wasn't something she heard with her ears. It was a thought, a cold, deep force that burrowed straight into her mind, sending a chill down her spine. The voice felt ancient, filled with an undeniable malice. It reverberated within her, wrapping around her very soul. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she stumbled backward. Emily then turned to her family, desperate for someone to acknowledge what was happening. But they were still oblivious. Their faces glazed over, as though they couldn't hear the same voice she did. It was as if they couldn't see the shadow at all. Miriam looked up with a slight curiosity in her brow, but offered no further response. She asked Emily what was wrong in a gentle voice, but her eyes still appeared to be distant. She would say, "You're looking at that shadow, aren't you? The one that's been in that corner for years?" The words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. Emily responded, saying it wasn't just a shadow, but something much darker. Miriam didn't react. Instead, she turned back toward her work in the kitchen, her movements stiff and awkward, as if avoiding the conversation. Daniel didn't respond either. His eyes glazed, his attention locked on nothing at all. Ethan was still absorbed in his phone, completely unaware of the growing terror in the room. Emily urgently shook Ethan, begging him to look at the shadow. Ethan blinked slowly, his eyes unfocused, as if seeing her from a great distance, but quickly returned his attention to his screen. Emily felt her throat tighten, a knot of dread swallowing her whole. She turned back to the shadow. It had grown again. It was as if it were reaching for her. She could see the darkness swirling now, the edges of the shadow flickering like it was alive, pulsing with some sort of dark force. Her breath quickened and she stumbled back. The shadow now was almost at the center of the room, hovering just out of her reach. The temperature continued to plummet, the chill seeping into her bones, and Emily felt like the entire room was suffocating her. Her family, they acted as though nothing was wrong, as though the presence that filled the room wasn't something they should fear. And then just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The warmth rushed back into the room, but the weight of the lingering dread did not dissipate. The air felt heavy now, thick with something Emily couldn't quite name. She looked around. Miriam, Daniel, and Ethan didn't acknowledge the change, as if the shadow had never existed. That night, as they gathered around the tree to open presents, Emily could hardly focus on the joy around her. Her mind raced, her thoughts tangled in confusion and terror. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, Something had been wrong all along. As the family went to bed, Emily lay awake in the guest room, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. There was something her family wasn't telling her. Something buried deep within this house. Something tied to the shadow she had seen. It wasn't until weeks later, when Emily uncovered the truth, that the full horror of that Christmas Eve became clear. Her great-grandfather, her mother's grandfather, had died in the very same room, exactly where the shadow had appeared. His body had been found in the corner, his eyes wide with terror, frozen in a death-like state that no one could explain. The family had always refused to speak of it, burying the memory as deep as possible. But the shadow, that presence, had never left. It lingered, feeding on the fear of those who lived here, growing stronger with each generation. The shadow wasn't just a dark force in the corner of the room. It was an ancient evil, tied to the very foundation of their home. But that night, the night of the Christmas Eve shadow, had been a warning. It was the family's darkest secret, one that should never be able to escape. The shadow may have disappeared, but the truth is still lurking, hidden beneath the surface. But will Emily ever uncover the full horror of her family's past? Or will the shadow claim her too? If you enjoy videos like this, make sure you go ahead and subscribe, hit that like button, and turn on post notifications so you get notified when I upload. Remember, the darkest secrets are often the ones closest to home.